Hello everyone, welcome back to another painting tutorial video. In this video I'm going to show you how to paint Lady Olynder, Mortarch of Grief. Here is the list of colors that I'm going to use in this video. Right, before I start painting, I decided to cut the small piece from the head joint in order to glue the veil together and to make it fit properly when the assembling part comes. Always make sure you dry fit yours before gluing in order to get the best result when assembling the miniature. I have the veil with the handmaidens assembled and the body assembled separately and primed them with Celestial Grey. I left the thorns with roses on the top section on the sprues in order not to break them or lose them during the painting progress. So the first areas that I am going to paint are the robes of the handmaidens and the dress for Lady Olynder. The first color that I'm going to use is Incubi Darkness. I use a small base brush and start base painting the lower section of the dress. Where the torn pieces of the dress start, then I apply thin lines where I want the transition to start. I use the same method for the banshees, except in the opposite way, starting from the shoulders. Once with the small base brush method is done, then I make thinner lines with a small layer brush to smooth the transition. Now I am going to use Nihiliakh Oxide Technical and start base painting all the areas that are left with the Celestial Grey. As you can see, I am trying to get help from gravity by holding the model upside down, and just where the Incubi Darkness area is, I start to apply the paint in order to get the transition. I also apply it on the veil. Once the technical is completely dry, I am going to use a mix of Coelaia Greenshade and Lahmian medium, 1 to 3 part ratio, and I'm going to use multiple layers of this wash. The first layer is an all even wash. Just quickly showing you that, as mentioned with the banshees, I did the same thing with the robes. For the veil, I only give one layer for now. I am applying a second layer, but this time I am putting more focus on the transition areas. Already with the second layer, you can slowly start to see how the transition will go. Then I apply a third layer as well, making sure that I put less and less where the brighter area is, and moving it towards the darker area. In this way I have a smooth transition. Now I am applying a fourth layer, but this time I am moving it from a little bit from the brighter spot, so in that way I really have that transition as smooth as possible. And as a final layer, I make a mix again, but this time a 1:1 part ratio, Coelaia Greenshade and Lahmian medium, and finishing the transition. Now that I'm happy with the transition, I can start highlighting these areas. First I'm going to use Ulthuan Grey, and with a small dry brush I start dry brushing the top section of the body, just until the hip and also the very top part of the crease. I also give a full dry brush for the veil, and let's not forget the Banshee Spirit Waves as well. Now I'm going to swap to a small layer brush and start highlighting all the sharpest features of the dress, the details on the corset and also the curves. And on the veil, I start highlighting the features of the face, such as the cheekbone, the orbital part on the forehead, the top part of the nose and also the chin. And let's not forget all the holes on the veil too. I also use wet blending on the forehead. I water down the color and applying it gently on the top part to get a nice lighting effect on it. Now I am going to add a fine highlight using white scar. With a small detail brush, I apply it on the sharpest features on the corset, also on the chest area. On the veil, I am using it only in small areas where I can see that the light is hitting. I use water blending again and applying just a touch on the forehead. I need to highlight also the darker areas, so for that I'm going to use first Kabalite green and making an edge highlight on the mid part section of the body. This means that I make sure that the robes on the banshees are layered as well, just to get a really smooth transition. And finishing the darker areas with a highlight of Sybarite green. Just a nice edge highlighting more towards the top area, so it gets a nice blending. I want to give for the veil a darker finish, so first I make a mix of Nighthaunt Gloom mixed with Lahmian medium, a 1 to 2 part ratio, and start applying it on the edges of the veil. Now I am going to add a glaze to the whole green areas, because Waywatcher green is no longer in product and you can buy it but for enormous price. I decided to make my own glaze. I use Biel-Tan green wash and Lahmian medium, 1 to 9 part ratio mix. I apply it on the dress and also on the robes. If you want, you can also add just a touch of it to the head, so that to give a smoother transition and make the shades of the skull more visible. And finishing the veil by using only Nighthaunt Gloom and applying it on the edges, so that the Handmaiden's ghostly waves create more contrast with the veil. Now the majority of the robes are done, I can focus on the hair. First up, I'm going to use Ogryn Camo as a base color for Lady Olynder's hair. Now it is a layer paint, so I am going to add multiple layers of this color just to have an even base color to the hair. Now I'm going to give a wash with Athonian Camoshade. I want to have a same greenish scheme to the hair, just to match for the dress. So with this camo green wash, it's gonna be giving a really nice tone to it. Once the wash is completely dry, I am going to use Morghast Bone, and I use a small dry brush and start dry brushing the hair. Now I'm going to use Screaming Skull, and also with a small dry brush I'm focusing more on the edges of the hair and some of the parts where it is gonna be still visible because of the veil. Now to make sure I have a really nice smooth transition, I'm using now a medium layer brush and start base painting all the edges of the hair with Screaming Skull. And also some of the top raised areas I give a highlight. And to finish it with some Ulthuan grey, just to have a little bit more ghostly effect to it, I use a small dry brush and apply it on all the edges. Now I'm going to focus on the Handmaiden's hourglass and chest. So the first color I am going to use is Doombull Brown, and I will use it on the chest. With a small layer brush I apply it. Now I am going to apply Nuln oil wash on the Doombull Brown area. Once the wash is completely dry, I use Kislev flesh and I use an old brush and start dry brushing the chest. Once the dry brushing is done, I am using a small layer brush and just give an edge highlight in some of the raised areas where I dry brushed it with Kislev flesh. Moving on to the hourglass. For the glass, I use Kantor blue as a base color. Now I'm going to use Nuln oil wash again and give it a wash on the Kantor blue area. Once the wash is completely dry, now I'm going to use Thousand Suns blue. I use a small layer brush and I want to give it a nice lighting effect. So obviously first the bottom section where the broken piece is, I start layering till the edges. And on the top section, on the left and on the right section, I start to make a sort of triangle part. I am now using a mix of Thousand Suns blue and Fenrisian grey 1:1 part ratio. I also add a little bit of water to the mix and start applying it on the inner parts, on the areas where I first layered it with the Thousand Suns blue. It is also good to add on the broken area to get a good highlight on it. Now I'm going to use Fenrisian grey and just applying it on the center parts where will be the brightest. You will see too that the colors are still sort of sharp, so whilst it's wet, I add just a touch of Thousand Suns blue and start painting the outer rim of the Fenrisian grey, and in this way you get a smoother contrast. Now I'm going to use Ulthuan grey, and with this color I'm giving even less, just a dot on the brightest part and also on the broken bottom part, making sure an edge highlight to get the broken glass well contrasted. And finishing it, the highlighting with even less white scar, so just a tiny touch of this in the most highlighted areas. Now I want all these colors to be blended together nicely, so I'm going to add Drakenhof Nightshade. And with this wash, I am going to achieve a really nice, smooth transition. Now I'm going to seal it with Ardcoat, and with this technical, once it is dry, it's going to be really giving the effect of that it's glass. Now I'm going to focus on a lot of other details, such as the metal, the gold, the handmaiden's skulls and the hair. So the first thing I'm going to start with is using Leadbelcher and start applying it on the hourglass's handle part. I'm going to use on all the gold details as a base color Balthasar gold. I use it on the chest, on all those small little details. I also base paint the lower and the top section of the hourglass. Lady Olynder's crown. And also the staff. Once the metallic parts are done, I'm going to use Zandri dust for the skulls of the banshees. After the skulls, I base paint the hair of each banshee with Mechanicus standard grey. Now I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade on the hair and on the skull. I leave the gold parts for now. I'm gonna be giving a different shade for them. Once the Agrax Earthshade is dry, and now I'm using Nuln oil, and this wash I'm using mainly on the hairs of the banshees. I wash the hair around halfway. And because I want to give a spiritual finish for the hairs, I'm using Coelaia Greenshade on the second half of the hair. So while the Nuln oil is still a bit dry, I'm trying to mix the two washes so it gets a nice blending. Now that the washes are completely dry, I'm moving back to Mechanicus Standard Grey. And with a small layer brush, I start layering each hair. Now, I could use a dry brush. It is personal preference really, but I want to make a selected highlighting to the hair, so that is why I am layering. Now that all those selected hairs, I'm going to highlight with Dawnstone. I'm a little bit more focusing on the raised edges of each individual hair. And giving a fine highlight with Administratum Grey. Very thin lines, just mainly the most raised areas, just to give a little bit of shininess to the hair. Now I can focus on the skulls, so I'm going to use Morghast Bone, and with a used old brush I start dry brushing each skull. And following it with a small layer brush and start layering the sharpest features of each skull. Now I'm going to use Screaming Skull as a highlight. So with a small layer brush I start highlighting the cheekbones, the top nose section, and also base paint the teeth. And with a touch of Reichland Flash Shade, I just apply a very little amount. I still want to give it a little bit more contrast to the bone to have a slight skin finish. Now I'm moving on to the gold details, and for this I'm going to use Reichland Flash Shade Gloss. So I start applying it on all the gold detailed areas. So because it's a gloss wash, so it's gonna be giving a shiny effect. All around the edges where it is already painted, I'm trying to be as neat as possible, not to go over to it. Once the wash is completely dry, now I'm going to use Hashnot Copper and just give a slight dry brush on each of the gold details. Now I'm going to use Retributor Armor, and again with an old small brush I use dry brush, and I'm doing the left side. I want to have the bottom part to make it shiny, but on the right hand side I want to have the top section shiny, so it gives a nice transition and contrast to the gold on the helmet. And also you can use this on the staff and the hourglass as well. The gold details on the chest, I leave them for now, because the details are too small. And finishing all the gold details with Stormhold Silver. Again with an old brush, I use dry brush technique, and just some of the most raised surface areas I give a gentle dry brush. I'm going back to Retributor armor, and with a small layer brush I finish the chest details. Now I can move on to the skin. So for the skin I'm using Ironrock skin as a base color. So I apply it for the Banshees and also Lady Olynder's hands. I am trying to be as neat as possible, especially around the other places which are already painted. And now that I'm done with the base color of the skin, I'm using a mix of Drakenhof Nightshade and Lahmian Medium, 1:3 part ratio, and start to give a wash in all these skin areas. Now that the wash is completely dry, I can start layering the skin, and I'm using Deepkin Flesh. I focus on the most raised area of each hand and also the knuckles, some of the fingers, just to have that nice highlight to it. Now I'm going to give a fine highlight with Pallid Witch Flesh. So again, the most raised surface, don't need too much, just a little, mainly on the knuckles, just to have that nice highlight. And of course, I want to give a little bit of still human remain on the models, so I'm using Reichland Flash Shade Wash. Don't use too much, just a very little amount, mainly on the hands, so that in this way I have a nice transition of a little bit of human spirit way. Now that most of the things are painted already, I can focus with the thorns and leaves. So I'm going to use Dryad Bark as a base color for the thorns. At this stage, I decided to glue the miniature together and place the rest of the thorns where it belongs to. So in this way, I have fully assembled the miniature and everything is painted equally. The next color I'm going to use is Death World Forest. And with this color I start to apply it on the end of each thorns and some of the spikes, and also it is good to base paint each individual leaves as well. Now that I have an earthy variation on the thorns, I'm going to use Athonian Camoshade Wash and give it a wash so that these two colors will be blending together very smoothly. Now that I know the wash is completely dry, I use Elysian Green as a layer. So with a small brush I start layering mainly on the thorns where I painted before Death World Forest, just to get a better highlight. And on the leaves I focus on the top section to give it a nice highlight. and finishing it with giving a fine highlight of Ogryn Camo. Don't need too much, basically just a dot on each end. It really gives a nice highlight to it. Now that the thorns are finished, I'm going to focus on the roses. I'm going to use Naggaroth Night as a base color. Sometimes it is quite hard to see what is leaf and what is the actual petal of the rose, so I'm taking my time and making sure that I have each of the roses covered equally. Now I'm going to use corn red, and with a small layer brush, mainly the center part of each roses, I'm painting it just to get a little bit of life into those dying roses. Now I'm going to use Nuln oil and give it a wash on each roses. After the wash, once it's dry, I'm going to use Demonet Hide and start highlighting all the rose petals. And finishing it with a fine highlight of Warp Fiend Grey. I am not using too much, mainly just some dots. Sometimes less is more. Now the only thing left is the gem on the staff. So I'm going to use Naggaroth Night as a base color for the gem. I give a wash of Nuln oil. I want to make sure that the purple and the gold is well blended together with this wash. I'm going to start highlighting with Xeros purple. On the top area, I try to fill one of the triangle so that the light is actually shining on it. And the rest of the edges, I just give an edge highlight. Now I'm going to use Slaanesh Grey and very thin lines I'm using on the gem and also on the center part. And finishing it with a white scar, just in the sharpest edges, a very little dot. And just to make it more shiny, I'm going to use Ardcoat and seal it with this technical. And there you have it, Lady Olynder, Mortarch of Grief is now finished. I really like this art scheme, which inspired this miniature. Here is a comparison. If you want to do something a little different from the original scheme, you can take example from this tutorial. If you made it till the end of this video, well done to you. This is one of my longest video tutorial, but also one of my favorite. If you're interested about how I made and painted the base for her, you can follow my channel for the next video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. Hit the like button so this tutorial can reach more people with the same passion. And don't forget the bell button if you want to be notified about future tutorials. That's all from me. Happy painting. Cheers.